Hey listeners, right before we get into this episode, a quick mention. I've referred to our guest, Cory Munchbach, as the president and COO of her company, but she has since been promoted to CEO. Even if you don't know Cory, when you listen to our conversation, you will immediately get a sense of why this promotion is so well-deserved. A big congrats to her from AdTech Unfiltered, and with that, let's get into the intro. More brands and agencies are doing exploration into how they can be consumer privacy-centric while simultaneously collecting and segmenting first-party datasets. Even though we've somehow escaped the sunsetting of third-party cookies yet another year, the well of precise advertising and marketing data is expected to dry up very soon. Hey everyone, I'm Noor Nasir, host of AdTech Unfiltered, and today we'll be looking at a tech stack opportunity that more brands are turning towards, CDPs or customer data platforms. To get a breakdown on what a CDP is, what it's for, how it's being used, and who's in the best position to use one, we speak with Cory Munchbach, President and Chief Operating Officer at CDP company BlueConic. While CDPs are not a turnkey solution like so many other ad solutions that advertisers are familiar with, they do offer a strategic opportunity to hone in on first-party data collection that goes well beyond the cookie-focused options of today. And time is of the essence for advertisers to explore new avenues. This episode on CDPs with guest Cory Munchbach starts right now.
We're moving into this cookieless future, and supposedly one of these future opportunities that they can embark on is a CDP. So there's a lot of curiosity. There's also a lot of confusion. Let me ask you a baseline question. What is a CDP?
Great. Let's start. I love it. Start entry level. I love that. Curiosity and confusion is probably the best two descriptors of this category. And interestingly enough, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this lately too, which is that in some ways there's never been more need for what a CDP does. And I'll answer that question in just a second. But at the same time, the category continues to be noisy and it's sort of confusing for everybody and what they're trying to figure out sort of how things fit. And that's always been a little bit of a tension with this particular category. What a CDP does at its most fundamental level is give largely non-technical users, I should say, people in the business, a database of first-party, individual, customer-level data that is designed to be used in the context of customer experience, of marketing, of digital product, essentially in a broader-based activation set. Lots of words in there that you could sort of unpack. And I think that's part of the challenge, right? Is that a lot of the things that I just mentioned means something a little bit different to each company, how it's structured, how they think about activation, how they think about customer experience. But all of it just to say, before CDP, you had a lot of channel-specific systems, or you had a lot of back-end IT data systems, but there wasn't something that served as the natural translation between the richness of the first-party data that you need to drive your business and the places where that data would inform consumer interaction. And CDP exists to be that sort of point in the middle of unification and activation for the customer, again, largely focused on those business sort of non-technical types of users in an organization.
So it sounds like there is this very exciting opportunity that CDPs can bring to the table, but along with that excitement comes more labor, more complexity to actually operate all the opportunities that could be born from a CDP. So you also mentioned first-party data, which is really at the center of the utilization of many data platforms, including a CDP. I think many of the clients that I have been entertaining conversations with and maybe just general marketers at large, they will think about first-party data in relation to a CRM system or like doing a CRM upload so that you can do some sort of matching and find people online. And that might be the kind of more foundational exposure that they have to what first-party data can bring to the table. So I'm curious, as far as from your perspective, Cory, how have you started to help clients who are curious about the CDP space to understand what are some of the prerequisites they need to bring as far as types of data so that they can take advantage of what a CDP can offer?
Yeah, this is a great question. I'm going to unpack a couple pieces of it because I think this is also, again, where some of the difficulty navigating this space comes into play. So, one of the biggest pieces is that, and I've been, as have you, an observer of marketing technology for a long time outside of my sort of current context. And one of the areas where I continually find buyers or users, however you want to think about it, sort of underprepared is being specific about the use cases that they are bringing to a given technology. And that could be CDP, but it could be any number of other tools as well. What I mean by that is that, segmentation or personalization isn't a use case. That's a capability. It could take a nearly infinite number of forms depending on who your customer is, what your business does, who owns that initiative, what other technology you have. So admittedly, part of the confusion comes from the fact that there's a lot of variables involved in a technology enabled kind of conversation, right? Again, not just CDP. Sort of the first part, sort of the where you start from is really nothing to do with the technology, is what are some of the issues or opportunities that you see in your organization that you have today, and sort of divorce that entirely from the tech. And so that can be things like, we'd love to be more individualized in our marketing, but we don't have the data, or we don't have access to the data, or we don't have access to the data at the sort of velocity that we need to have it in order to use it. Or could be that we don't have access to the data in a way that's scalable because it costs too much every time we need to pull the data. I just gave you in a couple of seconds a number of examples that would maybe largely be bucketed into a data access issue. But of course, which one or combination is going to mean something quite different for what might be the right solution to that problem. And so again, being really religious about how you are defining your problems and opportunities that you're trying to solve for has to be the place that folks start, rather than from the technology that you think is going to solve for it. That's my first call to action. And I beat the use case drum a lot. And it also directly relates to the question you asked around preparedness. You are going to be frustrated if you select a technology and then start to retrofit use cases to it, because even among the CDP category, they're not all identical. We all do different things and have maybe places that we over-index or under-index in terms of strengths. And so if you try to figure out after the fact the way that the technology is going to bring value to the business, it's going to be really, really frustrating. And then it also starts to answer the second part of that question, which is around sort of the data readiness. Are there, the way I think about it is, particularly EP buyers, what's the data that is closest to your customer and to the way that your organization drives revenue? So, that can be transactional data if you're a retailer. That's really, really important. If you're a publisher, it's subscription-based data. Where that lives already or how you get it is going to vary. But you want to try to get to that highest value data up front in prioritizing it around what do we know about you and how does it potentially impact the way we drive revenue for the business. That's also at least somewhat of a guard against the fact that, a lot of companies have the tendency to just say, well, let's bring all the data in and figure out what we're going to do with it later. Not only is that operationally inefficient, it's also really increasingly problematic when you think about privacy concerns and sort of wanting to move to a better data set that is actually usable, but without kind of needing to boil the ocean. So that's where the biggest bottlenecks are. Most companies are far less ready to embark on these initiatives as they think they are. And it's largely because of the lack of time spent thinking specifically about the use cases and how that relates to the data they should prioritize and what that roadmap looks like. So it's an awesome question, and one that really, I think, shapes a lot of the success or frustration that can come with some of these implementations and getting value over time.
I think there's a lot of legs to that question, right? It can just basically vein off in many directions, and it has to be answered in that way, right? It's not one question, it's kind of 10 questions baked into one as far as all the unpacking that needs to occur. This data readiness piece is something that requires a lot of planning and preparation on the part of the brand in order to figure out how they want to take advantage of a solution like a CDP. And I would say that we as an industry in the ad tech or MarTech space have become really acclimated to not always doing that pre-work. Instead, we'd like a solution to show up, and then we want to backpedal our way into that solution working for us so we can quickly propose that to higher ups that want to make sure that we're hitting some sort of marketing or advertising business goals. And we want it to be turnkey too. And I think that's another thing about CDPs is that it's not turnkey. It's this massive cruise ship or something of substantial size that's going to take a lot of time and energy to figure out how to make it work for the custom needs of your business and your marketing goals. With that, I wanted to ask you another question that was correlated with your past answer, which is doing the shepherding of the data, doing the wrangling of the data. You said that probably you don't want to have a big mess of information and then just say, let's move on this and figure it out after the fact. If I need to do that as part of my preparation to get ready, and I approach you and say, look, I'd like to get into starting a relationship with the CDP, but my data is very messy right now. I don't have a clear vision on what to do next. How would you direct me so I can get myself into a place where my ducks are in a row as far as getting that data ready to be entered into a CDP?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I would love more people to start from that place. The problem is often that the assumption that the data is all set. And so just sort of taking that for granted and not actually realizing that it's quite messy and then having to sort of fold that into the process. Because to be clear, that is a big part of the journey right out of the gate with CDP. Our expectation, in fact, is that the data is going to need some normalization, some cleansing, what have you. It's when we don't have enough understanding of how messy it is or what the state of it is in advance, nor does the potential customer, that it ends up being really, really sloppy. And we have many examples where we've gotten the data often from like old ERP type of systems, like things that nobody's really kept a good eye on, or certainly not the teams that we're working with. And the data comes in and they'll say, well, there's something wrong with the data. And it's like, yes, because the source system is wrong. And now for the first time, potentially in years, you have visibility into the fact that that data has been being managed poorly or what have you. And on the one hand, there are some customers who are psyched because they have visibility and now they can fix it. For others, it's actually really frustrating, like the ostrich effect, right? Where it's like, well, we didn't know it was a problem, therefore it wasn't a problem. But now that we've seen it and realize it, we actually have to do something about it. So, you have kind of mixed reactions. It can be sort of emotional. But in terms of like how to get started, again, we expect that there's going to need to be data that gets normalized or cleansed or tidied up, what have you. What is necessary to get that right, technically speaking, that's not necessarily a huge issue. It's more about what is the level of effort. Certain data is more complex. If it needs to be cleansed in a source system that is owned by IT, you need to get on that queue. Like there might be some operational considerations. And that's when we just have the conversation about what is, from a business perspective, the top priority here. Is the top priority to show that you can have value out of a CDP in about 3 months or so, right? You're still with a couple use cases. Cool. Then maybe we should focus on something that's perhaps a little bit smaller while we wait for some of the other data situation. We can run these things in parallel. Other customers, the priority, and there's total recognition that it's maybe going to take a little bit longer, but they want to get the data in first. And it's okay to not have some of those like quicker activation wins.
One of many things you just mentioned was that sometimes the data, maybe it's a little dusty. It needs to be cleaned up, and that there could be multiple sources from which it's coming. And maybe there are some antiquated systems in which that data is being stored currently, and that there's going to be this evaluation process. What does that evaluation process look like for you when somebody who is showing up 2 weeks before it's tax day and they have just like a mess of papers flying around? They're like, listen, I don't know how to do this. You're the expert. Help me figure this out. I feel like that's where a CDP like BlueConic might step in and would need to really consult an organization that's in a messy place. And you mentioned ERPs as an example of potentially an antiquated system. What do you want an advertiser or marketer to bring to you as part of that consultation process to make sure that you are, in fact, uncovering all the data sources that could be valuable to bring into a CDP?
It's a fabulous question. And quite frankly, it's pretty simple. On the one hand, we need the list of use cases and the way they're thinking about how you're going to use the data. And then on the other hand, any sort of sample data file that we can look at. So we have our amazing team who's been doing this for a long time, working with hundreds of customers. They know exactly what they're looking for when they look at 100-row sample that you pull from your CRM or what have you. And they will ask questions about the data structure, where it's coming from, the type of integration that we're going to use to bring the data in, how we want to think about storing it. All of these kind of questions are totally standard. Every customer's answer to them is going to vary, right? That's where the sort of the bespoke aspect of it comes into play. But again, it's not really rocket science. Typically, data can take a fairly finite number of forms, and it's just a question of being able to see it. So if we can see even a couple rows, a couple examples coming from different systems and have that to look at and then ask questions about, like, let's make some choices about what that should look like. And again, why you're going to use it in certain ways. One of the gaps that I think a lot more education can be done, and others, we can play a role in that and others. But the format and structure of data is directly related to the ways that it can be used, right? There's a reason you can't do anything with data in Google Analytics. It's how it's structured, it's how it's collected, right? That is an architectural question as much as it is an interface one. And so there are choices to be made about how you're going to use the data that need to be answered up front. And so it's just a lot of questions. But if we understand how you want to use the data, those use cases, and then we have some sample files from the places that are going to be coming in, it's really not overly complex after that to get to a sort of a place where, okay, this is what we're going to need. This is the kind of path forward and how that will look to make sure we can get the data into the system.
So you also mentioned use cases and that's part of the expectation as far as understanding, like, what does a client want? And I think that's a perpetual question that solution providers are going to ask of brands that they're working with. What's your expectation in association with, like, taking advantage of this relationship? But I think there's a little bit of the chicken and the egg scenario with CDPs, like a data platform opportunity where sometimes the advertiser or the marketer just doesn't know exactly what the opportunities could be. So how might you as a CDP solution provider help a client understand, or prospective client understand, what use cases might be on the table for them to take advantage of?
Totally. Okay, so a couple of things here. One is that generally speaking, there's at least sort of a high enough level of common use cases by industry, for example, right? We have opportunity to work with hundreds of customers. There are some common themes and types of use cases that our customers are using. We do a webinar every year on the last year's top 10 use cases for CDP in the year before. So we're putting that together in a library, documenting that. There's a lot of material out there. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of a point where, like, if you have no idea how or why you'd use a CDP, you're not ready to make the investment in one, because there are not just the technology partner that you're choosing, but you might not be staffed. You need to think about measurement. So it's incredibly important to us that our buyers are informed and ready so that when they choose us, we know that they've made the right choice. Because again, maybe we're not the best fit for you because you've got some funky edge use cases that another CDP is better designed for, or something like that. So there is a ton of material sort of out there. And then practically speaking, assuming you at least have a general sense of what you're trying to accomplish, our core methodology starts with a use case discovery workshop, really getting in there and asking questions. When you say this, tell us more about that. What does that mean? What other systems do you have in place? It's really a question of getting familiar with, how do you maximize value? What will that look like for us? What are common use cases for my vertical or companies of a similar size? We have tons and tons of material about that, case studies, et cetera. And then once we get started, it's a core component of implementation to be asking these questions and understand your priorities, make these recommendations, and kind of guide you along the way. We talk a lot about our customer experience has 3 core pillars: expertise, partnership, and empathy. Expertise, we can bring you tons of information for you to choose from and help you make the right choices. But partnership is also being right there with you and trying to help you navigate that, not just with the information, but the pros and cons and understanding your business so that we can make sure that you're successful. But a lot of that it's a lot of non-technical work, actually, to make the technology maximally successful.
I wanted to also ask you about something else that is really key for why somebody would want to embark on a CDP relationship or meet the threshold to make a CDP relationship valuable. And that is the volume of data that you need to bring to the table. So, Cory, if you could tell me a little bit more about how much data is expected for a potential marketer or a prospective marketer to bring to the table in order for a CDP relationship to be valuable. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's a hard one. It's a great question, but it's a hard one to sort of triangulate because, again, there's so many different types of data. You could have a business where, and I think actually this is a good way to illustrate this, is that our publishing customers, for example, have hundreds of millions of profiles in the platform, largely anonymous. It's web traffic, people coming back to read, but not necessarily authenticated or logged in. And of course, a big part of what publishers use BlueConic for is to increase the number of what we would kind of call recognized or addressable profiles. They have an email address or something about them that takes them beyond like a web cookie or what have you. By contrast, our retail customers and our folks that maybe have like a loyalty program or something like this, or heavy e-commerce, have fewer total profiles, but are much more addressable because, again, with a e-commerce, even those with loyalty programs, as I say, have an identifier that makes it sort of unique to you in a persistent way. Meanwhile, a sort of third example maybe I'll pull in is like our CPG customers who don't have a ton of profiles, nor do they have a ton of identifiable profiles. They're much more immature, if you will, in this journey because they've relied historically much more either on retail partners, right, shopper marketing and sort of collaborations there, or on third-party buying lists and or working with MSPs to sort of build up these third-party databases. So you may have 3 very large, very well-known organizations in 3 different industries that have completely different data volumes relative to the business, but how they might value sort of each profile is completely different. So I give that context because it's maybe less about, total number of profiles per se, and more about how does that reflect what's going on in your business. What I will say is that CDP, one of the sort of reasons for being is solving how complex the data ecosystem typically is within an organization. Whether, again, I mentioned, right, it's web, it's email, it's CRM, it's your former DMP, it's all of these pieces, it's your data warehouse. So if you don't have a lot of complexity in terms of channels and or inputs, then maybe CDP, at least companies like mine, where we're working on much larger sort of enterprise complex organizations, maybe there's a different CDP, a different sort of partner. But that's where that sort of assessment upfront, that readiness to go back to that question is so important, that you have a good grip on that and that you're matching your requirements with the right vendor. And of course, the right cost as well, right? You don't want to overpay if you're not actually using it or getting features that you don't find useful. So that's a good part of the readiness aspect that we were talking about before.
I'll just continue to extend our readiness conversation by asking about having talent internally that can be dedicated to the CDP. So that's something else I think in some other types of solution relationships or partnerships, a lot of the responsibility falls on the solution provider to do all the labor. Whereas I think when you have a customer data platform, you're going to want to have dedicated internal resources working on that. So how do you, in the event that you are working with a client or a marketer that doesn't have a clear understanding of what types of resources they need to put forth, how do you clarify what those expectations need to be so that they are making sure that they're investing appropriately?
This is a big one for me because I feel like marketing, and it's not all marketing or sort of marketing adjacent teams' fault, that are always being asked to do more, right? It's always being asked to do more with either the same amount or less. And people, staffing, skills, resources is in the crossfire of that. A couple things on this particular point. And this is, again, where we've done a lot of work, sort of different role types that we typically see and ways of structuring the project team to make sure that you're getting the most out of this. So that can be even things like from a governance perspective, right? How are you thinking about that? If you want to be more matrixed? What are the types of roles that you should be versus having more of a center of excellence? We've got customers with both. So thinking about the organizational implications of a tool that is inherently cross-channel or cross-system, cross-team is super, super important. There's not a wrong way to do it. There's not a right way to do it necessarily, just what makes sense for your organization. In terms of skill sets, this is actually really sort of personally, I have to say, being in this category for a while, very gratifying. We have a number of customers who are posting jobs right now for a CDP project leader. Forbes just posted a job to hire a CDP project lead. Heineken's hiring a consumer data strategist. Colgate is hiring someone focused on this for their Hills brand. So you're starting to actually see jobs crop up, either sort of product owner type of roles or more technical function roles, sort of be on the data side. What is generally and almost all kind of consistently true, what I would say, is that someone who is designated by the organization as a project owner or product owner type of role is really important. Again, to get the most out of this, you're talking about complexity. You're unlikely to have an organization where the same set of people is also the inputs and the outputs, and that's just probably unrealistic. And so having someone who is empowered to coordinate all of those different pieces is really key. In terms of the hands-on keyboard types of users, those folks often do exist kind of already in your org. Maybe they've been working on marketing automation. Maybe they were your DMP people before that. So that skill set is, especially once implemented, largely training and being able to make sure that you've got that stuff going on. The more complexity is during that implementation period where you likely have a lot more folks involved. We have a colleague who sort of describes it as, getting the plane to altitude and landing it, right? That takes much more skill than flying it. So, you thinking about those types of roles that need to be part of that. Also, you and I talked a few weeks ago about the role of agencies in this ecosystem, and I am very glad to see a lot more of sort of the SIs and digital agencies beefing up their CDP chops to help clients navigate this, because again, a lot of the time it's much more of a temporary role. It's, it's getting some stuff in there in the first place, but then letting it kind of live within the business. Agencies can play a hugely impactful and efficient role there as they build up those practices.
So let's expand the conversation down that road, because I'm glad you brought that up, because inevitably that needs to be a part of this conversation. Agencies are inevitably a part of these conversations. And the thing is, it is kind of a tricky place for an agency to be in, not to call an agency a middleman, but you are in the middle of potentially a really valuable solution that could be brought over to a marketer, and a marketing organization not knowing how to navigate that. And then also you suggesting something where a lot of the legwork and the blood, sweat, and the tears actually is going to fall on them in many ways too. So I'm curious as far as how you might advise an agency that sees a lot of value and that understands the benefits associated with a CDP. How might they want to broach the subject of how a client that they work with might want to consider going down a road of exploring?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, if you're an agency working with a brand or a publisher right now, you should be having this conversation, because the things that are largely driving CDP adoption, whether you end up investing in a CDP or not, are still happening to you. So for example, the third to first party data transition and cookie deprecation. If CDP doesn't end up being the answer, I have some questions for you, but let's just that headwind is happening. That transition is happening, whether you invest in the solution to fix it or not. We just watched 2 years where digital transformation and initiatives of similar kind of characterization. If you ask McKinsey, I think they said they were sped up by 5 years, right? All of these things that happened because of COVID accelerating, again, happening already, but now happening to you faster. That's not going to change. And meanwhile, sort of the ongoing changes to consumer privacy, consumer expectations of how they engage with brands, all of that is also continuing to happen, kind of whether you like it or not. So the answer to those things does not only lead to CDP, but it certainly leads to a world in which a CDP is part of how you navigate things that are happening to marketing and to brands and publishers right now. So there's an enormously important role for agencies to play in assessing on a customer by customer or client by client basis. What does this mean for you? How are we going to respond to it? How ready do we feel? There's just a massive and critical, I would say, role for agencies to be bringing their best practices from across their, their client base and making sure that everyone is ready to tackle this. And not just, I kind of think about it like whether you see it as the opportunity that I think it really can be, it's going to happen anyway, right? So the choice is yours, whether it happens to you or it happens for you. And I think agencies can be big advocates for making it happen for you instead of to you.
What's your experience as far as the ratio of how often an agency is coming to the table to engage with this conversation with you versus how often a marketer is coming to engage the conversation first?
It's still majority coming from the sort of marketing side, but I would say in the last like 12 or so months, it's become much closer, and you're seeing a lot more of the RFPs and sort of CDP evaluations coming from a brand or publisher having done sort of a data strategy or a broader business strategy with an agency in the first place. So they brought in someone to evaluate the company and like where we need to be investing. And one of the conclusions among likely many was, doing a CDP evaluation. So we're seeing sort of what I would call like an agency influenced decision to start looking at CDP much, much more common than in years past. So again, like last 12 to 18 months or so. And I would expect that trend to continue. And in addition to it being the right thing, because that's what the business world needs, it's also, let's be honest, like very self-serving. There's an enormous amount of work to be done, as we just talked about. Getting clients ready for CDP is no joke. I love doing use case workshops with customers, and I'm grateful when they use our materials, but we're not consultants. So there's a lot of opportunity that before we even get involved, where that work can be done, again, make more efficient use of the time that they do spend with us, the vendor, and an agency. That's a revenue stream in its own right, in addition to sort of being the logical, I would say, place to be spending time. So an upward or an increasing trend, certainly, but I would say still the majority is coming from what ostensibly appears to be a brand having made a decision that this needs to be a part of where their organization's going.
Something we talked about earlier was that there are going to be some organizations out there that aren't ready, and maybe they're quite far away from being ready as far as potentially onboarding a CDP. Maybe they just seemingly are not in a position where doing something with a CDP is accessible in the short term. What would you suggest, knowing that we are moving into this cookieless future now seemingly faster than we were in the past, and organizations need to do more as far as making sure that they're getting pipe set up to capture first-party data, and maybe they're a couple years out from the potential opportunity of working with the CDP. Do you have any advice for those types of organizations that have really relied so heavily on the third-party cookie? They've perceived third-party cookie data as their data, and now they realize they need to become better stewards of their own first-party data. What would you say to them if they might have some preliminary years of work or whatever preliminary work they need to do that's going to take some time? What's your thoughts for that?
So I think it's a couple of things. One is like, you are ready now because you have to be. It just may be how you start that looks different. So I think the CPGs are a great example of this, where the question is not wait until we have enough first party data to then start using a CDP. No, this becomes your 0 to 1. You don't need to have had a CRM. You skipped that step. Fine, no problem. But like, you got to start somewhere. So it's more for me about, what are we building on top of? If it's going from literally only third-party data that's like hosted elsewhere and you have no control over it, then that's totally fine. That just means that we're going to start from use cases that are more geared toward building up your first-party data. I think Heineken is an amazing example of this. They've been a customer of ours for a few years. They started with largely web data and increasingly started to add physical events and online events, like actually like beer tastings and things like this. So you'd get data from people who registered for those and then started to build that up. And now several years in, they're expanding into all kinds of new channels. How they're thinking about and using that data is incredibly rich compared to where they were just a couple of years ago. But it started with, we have a DMP, we need to figure out how to move off of the DMP. And so there we go. So it was much more of a replacement type of scenario. On the other hand, if you look much more likely at our retailers and folks like that who have tons of first party data, transactions and loyalty programs and web data and all this other stuff, but it's just not combined into a single view of the customer that they can actually use, that's still a reason to start now. It's just, we use this Arthur Ashe quote a lot of start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. That needs to be today. It's just more of a question of, if you're going to say, well, we're not going to be ready for CDP for 3 years, that's not universally applicable. There may be some data cleansing if you're in that scenario. But if you're in the scenario of, we just need to have a first party data strategy, that needs to start this minute. And so like right sizing that answer to sort of where your organization is. But, if 3 years from now, you're like, okay, I'm ready for CDP, like that boat sailed on you in a big way, I think, unless you have a different answer for all of the things I talked about, right? First party data and being more resilient and agile and being able to keep up with your customers. You may have a different answer for that, but CDP is largely part of that. And I think we're a lot closer to everyone needing to have a clear answer for that for themselves than spending the next few years kind of getting ready for that eventuality. Like that's the good thing, I think, about Google's change in a lot of this. I mean, kicking the can down the road again was obnoxious and super self-serving, but they have put a deadline on us. Apple, this was a forcing mechanism. And as we all know, and I get why, like the MarTech, ad tech industry doesn't move unless it's forced to. So the forcing is happening. You've already missed your window if you were hoping to just kind of get to do it on your own terms. Like now is the time.
So I think what happens to some brands, and you mentioned this just moments ago, is that they may not have that thoughtful of a first party data strategy. So maybe unlike the Heineken scenario that you described, where they are doing a lot of collection, but there was some streamlining that went on, and then there was an opportunity for them to embark on the leveraging of a CDP in bigger and better ways. Whereas some people are just more in that dusty data space of, we really have just like left a lot of stuff in these archives in an archaic place. We don't understand how those things come together. There's cobwebs all over them. We're not dedicating resources to take a look at them in appropriate ways. And so I think some of your suggestion is to say that if you haven't started working on that internal work needs to start right away. And then also setting up more pipes for that data to be coming through in clean ways, and where there's a process to say, our intention is to orient these pools of data so that we can have it to have insights and new types of audiences extrapolated. I feel like that might be a larger suggestion.
That's a big part of it. There's some sunk cost fallacy aspects of this too, which is like, is the data worth bringing in? Really? I mean, I know you spent a lot of money on it. I totally get it. Fair. But let's be honest with ourselves, right? You have this opportunity, oftentimes we see with new customers where they come in and they say, we're going to import 5 years worth of data into CDP so we can use it for segmentation, all stuff. And then we start to look at it with them, right? We look at those data files that I talked about and we sort of get in there and it's like, turns out a lot of it is garbage. A lot of it doesn't have great lineage around consent or opt-in. You're not really sure if it's really that great. Do you want to spend the resources cleaning it? Or do you want to say, you know what, maybe we just bring in 2 years worth of it. That's enough to be the basis for some from historical trending and things like that to inform what we want to do next. But maybe we don't need to saddle ourselves with the baggage of what came before. Another example that I often will talk about with is like third-party data appends, which are still legal in the US. And we get the question, can you bring in data from those types of sources? And of course, technically, we can, right? It's a file and it's, you import it the same way you import a lot of data. But the real question is, you're about, again, have a clean slate of first party data that you can confidently say is consented and the lineage of all of it. How much do you really want to bring in of third party data that maybe isn't legal in a couple years, right? Or maybe in a shorter period of time. And there may be use cases for it. Again, we come back to the use cases and the value there. But I do find that the CDP conversation is an opportunity to sort of really check some of our assumptions and start fresh, or at least start from a better place. And sometimes that isn't just cleaning up. It is saying, we're just going to put this one in the graveyard and be okay with it and move it on. And we see that pretty often. It's not usually the starting point, but we often do get there when people have that chance to sort of be confronted with like, start fresh or just kind of leave some things behind.
Yeah, and I think a part of that confrontation and starting fresh can be a frustrating one for some marketers who thought, right, that they had all this information that was going to be available to them. And now they also need to bring in legal and these new consumer privacy regulation considerations, and then saying, okay, not only can we not use the data from yesteryear, we also need to bake in new processes that consider consumer privacy in ways that we haven't considered consumer privacy. Like, I think there are definitely brands out there that are doing kind of the bare minimum as far as, hey, I think that these are absolute necessities as far as us to not get our hands slapped in relation to regulation. But if you're going to dive deep into some of these types of conversations, you need to think about how is that data being acquired? Are you meeting that consented threshold? And I think there are still brands today that are not having those conversations.
And you're absolutely right. And the other part of it is that it's not just the consent. It is, we should be asking ourselves, what is the value we're providing back to the customer? Let's also not take for granted that this is just a consent sort of checkbox situation. Is why would anyone want to consent? What are we doing? What are we giving them that is so valuable that their precious data? If we think it's so precious, then we should be holding ourselves to a standard of giving them something of kind of comparable value back. I sort of use this as a thought exercise sometimes. Like, if we were to end up in a situation where every single website was just a blank screen, unless you sort of ostensibly logged in every time, right? You had to put an email in or something like that. Is your content, is your product, is your brand experience, is your media worth someone jumping through that hoop? Would they do that? I mean, every single time, right? Every single time. Are they going to do it? Do they like you enough? Because if you feel nervous about a scenario where that like level of gate came into play, then you need to look at much more than just your tech and your consent and your governance. You need to be thinking about the brand experience and the quality of what you're doing, because that is the equity that you are playing with.
Do you have any advice for brands that have been locked up in a scenario of where they're doing a lot of their marketing or advertising leveraging just third-party cookie data? Like, they're in the business of using Facebook and site retargeting and search and behavioral targeting, just a lot of third-party cookie focus. And now they need to start to root themselves in understanding that we have a road ahead of us and we need to get moving quickly, knowing that there is this anticipated date where these mechanisms that we've become reliant upon will no longer be available. And I know you shared a lot of advice at the front end of our conversation, mentioning use cases and questions you need to ask yourself. But if you feel disoriented, what do you say to those types of clients? How would you advise them as far as how to take themselves out of the state of overwhelm and move into a state of action?
Yeah, I love it. Perfectly phrased as well. This is going to maybe be a little bit of an unconventional answer. Marketing and finance need to have a conversation, because transitions like this are rupturing. There are going to be performance implications while you transition away from something to another mechanism of driving the business, especially if you have not started, right? The benefit of having gotten started sooner and starting now is that you maximize how much overlapping runway you're going to get between, the full end of your DMP and whatever you replace that with on the other side. It gives you more opportunity to experiment and figure out what works. So your job right now is to give yourself as much runway to try new and different things as you possibly can before everything actually becomes no longer possible. And the only way to do that and do that well is to kind of buddy up with finance on this and be like, look, this is how much we're spending. This is the implications of it. And ask finance to help model out, like, okay, if we change this and we do that, what are the implications here? And help us message that to the rest of the organization, right? That this is a planned loss or a planned, couple quarters where it's going to have an impact on margin or what have you. Like, that's sort of what I said, that this can either happen for you or happen to you. It's going to happen. So being able to proactively tell the story, describe what it is that you're doing, be specific, as opposed to just saying like numbers are down because third-party cookies are going away. Like, sure, that's true, but why leave it at that? So talking to finance, figuring out some of that modeling, and start to think about if you look at whether it's marketing or advertising, how much of it is driven by third-party data, to what extent, if you had the means, assume that the technology exists because the technology always exists, but what would be a logical replacement or a good adjacent replacement, for example, to what you're using? And then make a list of that. Technology agnostic to start. Do an audit of that. Start to try to map that up. And then you start to look at, okay, where would I get this data? Do we have an option to get it today? Does it need to be a vendor? Does it need to be a CDP? Does it need to be a data warehouse? Whatever the questions and answers are, you can start to look at those. But there will be a cost, of course, and it's going to take time. And one of those is finite, and it's the time. So being able to get started on it, it can be overwhelming. But my company is half Dutch, and there's a saying in Dutch, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So this is, I think, the moment that we're at. I know it feels big and scary, but there is a path forward. And like I said, sort of partnering with the business from a finance perspective on that and really treating it as a business thing as opposed to just a marketing kind of issue is really, really critical, I think, to being successful and having the kind of transparency and narrative around that to make it successful and to make it effective for people.
Final question on my end. Are there any things that are burgeoning on the horizon for CDPs for brands and advertisers to be excited about?
So much. I think in some ways, CDP has been around for a long time, yet the confusion still exists. And we're still only scratching the surface of the kinds of use cases and cool things that the platform can do. I'm super energized about some of the things that data science can start to be brought into the mix and figuring out how to do better optimization of the experience with smarter algorithms, things like that. A lot of this stuff around privacy and the forcing mechanism that it represents for how brands think about their customer engagement strategy, I think is a long time coming. And being able to use the data to inform those choices and be able to do more effective kind of privacy experience at scale, I think that really gets me excited as well. And then the last thing I think is just a huge amount of opportunity still on kind of the orchestration lifecycle side of things, where not just right message, right person, right place, but sort of sequencing. And a lot of this to me has to do with being able to do really hard things at scale, which is a big shift. And I think we're still, again, kind of scratching the surface on some of those areas, but I expect to see big kind of leaps and strides in the coming couple of years for sure.
A lot of things for advertisers and marketers to reflect on if they haven't gotten onto the path of pursuing a CDP. So appreciate the time and the introduction to CDPs and things to look forward to in the future.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again to Cory Munchbach, President and Chief Operating Officer at BlueConic, for giving a breakdown on customer data platforms for advertisers and marketers. Like Cory mentioned, there's a dearth of information out there for advertisers to assess if adding a CDP is the right next step for a first-party data strategy. With the volume and variety of customer data platforms becoming more diverse and accessible, it's a great time to explore options. You can go to the BlueConic website to learn more. That's it for now, and thanks for listening to AdTech Unfiltered. I'm Noor Nasir, and another episode coming up real soon.